Welcome, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's ADHD Experts presentation titled, I Can't Focus When ADHD Impacts Your Child's Math and Writing Performance. Math and writing are two academic subjects that require extensive working memory and executive function that we know is strained by ADHD. Students' challenges in math and writing largely multiplied during the pandemic thanks to virtual classes, and now we're seeing that learning gaps have widened for many students. But rest assured, there is plenty that parents and educators can do to help right the ship. In today's webinar, we will learn strategies, study skills, and other techniques to improve your child's math and writing performance and boost their confidence around school. Leading today's presentation is Ann Dolin. Ann Dolin is the president and founder of Educational Connections, a company that specializes in helping students with ADHD and executive function issues build confidence through virtual one-to-one sessions. Ann is a former public school teacher who holds a bachelor's degree in child psychology and a master's in special education from Boston College. Ann has spent more than 25 years in education, teaching and tutoring students from kindergarten through college. She founded Educational Connections in 1998. Her team now includes more than 100 highly credentialed and caring subject tutors, test prep tutors, college consultants, and executive function coaches. Before I hand over the microphone to Ann, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned in to the live webinar may download the slides now. Just click on the event resources section of your webinar screen to find them. And if you are interested in the certificate of attendance option, look for instructions in an email you will receive about an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 397 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. And finally, the sponsor of this week's webinar is Landmark College. Landmark College summer programs provide an intentional and supportive community that assists students who learn differently, including high school students, graduating high school seniors, and students enrolled at colleges around the country. Programs are designed to enable students to identify strengths and learn specific strategies to be successful. Instructors consist of current LC faculty, as well as teachers from the surrounding area who are experienced in working with students who learn differently. Visit landmark.edu/summer to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Ann Dolin. Thank you, Ann, so much for joining us today and for leading this really important discussion on how to help our kids and their learning challenges.
Well, Annie, thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here with you and all of the other parents from ADDitude Magazine. So welcome. Today, we're going to dive deep into math and writing. But before we get started, I want to share with you a little bit about what I'm hearing from my end. You know, for the last 25 years, my tutors, executive function coaches, and college consultants have been helping students throughout the country to improve their abilities and success in school. And when parents call our office every day, they have lots of things that they're sharing with us. And let me share a couple of those things as we talk about some of the issues that our kids are facing. Some parents say just sitting down and focusing is a battle, especially in math. I'm worried that my daughter won't be able to keep up. If it's like this in 7th grade, what's it going to be like in high school? I constantly feel like I'm nagging my son about his writing assignments. He hates to write. I've got 2 other kids to worry about. She's not my only one. Now, on the flip side, here's what kids say. Why do I have to know this? It's so stupid. I'm never going to have to use it in real life. Don't micromanage me, Mom. I'll do it eventually, okay? I promise I'll turn it in. Don't worry. Any of this sound familiar? Now, on the other side of the table, when we work with students, our tutors and executive function coaches are reporting something different. They're seeing the fallout from the pandemic. Here's what they're saying. Handwriting skills really suffered during COVID, and now some kids don't even want to hold a pencil. Kids feel like their teachers are going too fast this year. Maybe it's to make up for lost ground in the prior 2 years. Many students are missing fundamental skills, especially in pre-algebra and algebra, which we know those are the proving grounds for every other math kids will see in high school. And my students had such a hard time in these large Zoom rooms, but the good news is I can feel that this one-to-one help is really helping them to turn the tables. So when we hear of difficulties kids are having from in school, whether it be from their parents, their teachers, or people that work closely with them, we could think, well, it's anecdotal. Maybe it's not so bad after all. But here's the reality. A recent study from McKinsey and Company found that when looking at progress from students kindergarten through 8th grade, because of COVID, kids are about 4 months behind in math and 3 months behind in reading. And recently, in 2022, in the Journal of Attention Disorders, this study found that students with ADHD are having a hard time making up lost ground in large classrooms, and that they need more specialized support in the form of small groups and one-to-one attention. So what do we do with all this information? We know that kids with ADHD are more impacted than ever before, largely because of COVID. Part of this is because of their difficulty with working memory. And working memory and ADHD often go hand in hand. So what is working memory, you might be wondering? Well, it's not short-term memory. It's not long-term memory. It's actually the brain's ability to juggle multiple things at the same time and then execute on a task or solve a problem. So here are some examples that we might see in real life. Multi-step tasks. Hey, Johnny, go up to your room, get your coat, put on your gloves, and don't forget to brush your teeth. Chances are Johnny will come downstairs with his coat, but he hasn't done the other 2 things. It's a lot to remember. We see this in academics as well. Writing, it's so complex. It's complicated. Oh, I have to remember. Did I answer the prompt? Do I have a topic sentence? Does this make sense? Do my sentences flow together nicely? Have I used a capital letter? Are my words spelled correctly? Do I have correct punctuation? Am I using rich vocabulary? In reading, some of the same issues. Oh, who is that character again? What did he do? Why is he important? Where am I in the sequence of events? What's important here? And then in math, let's take long division. Oh, I have to remember to take the divisor and the dividend. Oh, put the answer at the top, multiply those, put the answer below, then subtract, carry down, start that all over again. Oh, are my numbers neat enough to read? Is this organized enough for my teacher? It's a lot to remember. So for many of our kids, they're struggling. And for many parents, they see it in their kids. And parents, they're feeling like they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. They're worried that their child is behind, but they also know that their kids may not be getting the practice they need in order to make up for lost ground. What is practice? Well, largely, practice is in the form of homework. And what happens when kids are struggling in school, especially students with weak working memory, if something's difficult, if it's cumbersome and arduous, they go into avoidance mode and they refuse to do the work altogether. So they don't get the practice in the form of homework because they're not doing it. Sometimes, however, kids, maybe they're in a self-contained classroom because they have an IEP, or maybe they're at a school that doesn't give much follow-up work, not much homework. They don't get the chance to have very much practice and make up those skills. Not to worry, it's okay. I've got you covered. Today, I'm going to share with you what to do. We're going to talk about writing, strategies for math, and because we're already approaching the summer, we're going to talk about summer learning as well. Now, if you're not even in the mode of summer yet, and you're just thinking, oh my gosh, let me just get my kid through the school year, that's okay too. I've actually compiled a list of resources for you, blogs I've written specific to kids with ADHD and homework. And you can get those by texting. So if you have your phone nearby, this is a good time to pull it out, or just a piece of paper and pencil. I'm going to share with you some links as we go on. You can jot them down. But if you have your phone, you can text the number 55444 and then type in the word homework, and this information will come directly to your inbox. All right, so let's say we're in homework mode. We're not thinking summer yet. We need to get our kids through the school year. What does that look like? Well, first, work that their focus is increased and their distractions are decreased. We want to increase focus, decrease distractions. So first, for most students, that means a break, some type of downtime before they start their work. It also means an ideal space. And I would say that with kids with ADHD, many parents make the mistake that the environment has to be almost sterile, like super quiet for them to focus. And that's often not the case. Sometimes kids do best in a hum of a busy area, like plop down at the kitchen table while you're cooking dinner. There's a reason so many people are in Starbucks doing their work. They function better with energy around them. So if this is the case for your child, I would recommend getting some noise canceling headphones so they can be in the hum of the busy area, but they can still have decreased distractions. Other things that help: gum. Chewing gum keeps you alert. Fidgets. I love fidgets. Fidgets are great for kids of all ages, not just little kids. Take a look at the one in the bottom right panel of your screen. And it's called a monkey fidget. And it's basically, I wish I invented this. It's so simple. It's this mesh bag, and it has a marble in the middle. And basically, kids can move the marble back and forth with their fingers. But they love it because it kind of gives them something to stay stimulated while they're doing their work. Other things that help for many kids: a weighted blanket. And this is basically something that just keeps kids grounded, more secure. So with kids with sensory issues, this is often really helpful. All right, so we set the stage for getting started. Let's move into writing strategies, because I know this is part of the reason you're here. What is the problem with writing? Well, we already talked about the issue with working memory and trying to remember to do so many things while you're writing. And for that reason, often kids are overwhelmed and they're underprepared. They want to do the work. Trust me, every kid wants to do well in school. But when you're overwhelmed and you don't have the skills, what does your brain do? You go into avoidance mode. You try to do something else that's a lot better than writing. How can parents help? First, again, let's set the stage. For younger students that are writing with pencil and paper or pen and paper, experiment with different types of grips. If your child has an awkward grip, go onto Amazon and type in pencil grips for kids, and you'll find lots of different ones. Order a few, experiment with them. Also, consider a slant board. A slant board is, and again, go to Amazon, Google slant board, or type in slant board, and you'll find it. It's basically just a wedge that your child can put on their desk, and it allows kids, instead of pressing down, which is often why kids are so fatigued when writing, it alleviates that pressure because you're writing on a slant, making it easier. For older students that are beyond that and that are keyboarding everything, I really like the idea of a mechanical keyboard. And for kids with sensory issues, when the keys are flat, like you see in many laptops, it's hard to discern which key you're on. Kids do better when the keys are raised and they can feel their way around the keyboard better. In fact, my oldest son, he has ADHD, and this is his favorite keyboard. It's a Logitech, a mechanical keyboard. There's tons of them out there on the market. But what's also neat about a mechanical keyboard is it has this up light underneath. So you can turn it green, red, multicolors. And for many kids, that novelty increases their attention. So we set the stage. Let's talk about actually getting started. For many kids, at least the kids we work with, this is the hardest part for them, is getting going. So we share with them, you know what? You have to trick your brain into thinking that what you're going to do isn't so hard after all. Your brain doesn't want to do things that are hard. Your brain is in self-preservation mode. So if you're on TikTok scrolling from videos, your brain says, oh, this feels good. Let's keep doing it. Writing? No, that's hard, boring, and way too difficult. So here's how you trick your brain. You grab a timer. Here's one of my favorite. It's a time timer. You've probably seen it before, really popular in the ADHD community. I love it because it has this red floating disc that moves with elapsed time. So here's how you use it, or any timer really. And I'd say a physical timer is better than the timer in your phone. So you grab your timer and you say, all right, brain, I'm going to only make you work for 5 minutes. I call this one the 5 minutes of fury, or 10 minutes. I call this tolerable 10. Here's the idea that anybody can tolerate anything for just 10 minutes. So you set the timer for, say, 10 minutes, and you repeat this mantra. I'm going to work as hard as I can, best as I can, focus as much as I can, just for 10 minutes. And when the timer goes off, I can take a break, or I can keep on going. Usually kids can keep on going. They need the timer to get them started. So that's how you start with using a timer to set a very small amount of time and teach kids that mantra. We're always revisiting that mantra with kids. You can do it by task too. So some parents report that their kids are anxious with timers. And if you have a child with anxiety and you've tried this before, I would not push the envelope. Do something different. You can do the same thing, but with task. So you say, all right, brain, I don't want to do this entire 3-paragraph essay. I'm willing to write the first sentence. Does that work for you? So you basically say, I'm going to work as hard as I can, best I can, focus as much as I can, just to write this first sentence, and I'll take a break. In math, it might look like, oh, I'll do every other problem, or I'll just do the first 3, or I'll start with 5 of the easiest. That's how you trick your brain to start by task. Now, when we write, before we even get started, we want to make sure our thoughts are organized. That makes getting started so much easier. I think one of the best ways for kids to organize their thoughts is through some visual depiction, like a graphic organizer. So what is a graphic organizer? A graphic organizer is a visual framework that shows relationships between things. So let's say the English teacher says to your child, all right, listen, Becky, you need to write a compare and contrast essay. That feels overwhelming. I'm not going to do that. And if I do, I'll just slap a few things down on the paper and say I did it. But with a graphic organizer, it's so much easier. Let's say the topic is about elephants and rhinos. So you research what are the main qualities, or what are the important things about an elephant? What are the important things about rhinoceros? Write that down. And then in the middle of this Venn diagram, you're writing down things that they have in common. Now you have the outline for a 3-paragraph essay, and it is so much easier. You can also help your child by acting as a scribe. So if you have a student who's really struggling to get going, and maybe they're not quite at the graphic organizer, but they just need to write down a few sentences, you can be their scribe. This is generally for younger kids, maybe middle school kids. We use this strategy all the time with students just to kind of get them over the hump. So here's how it works. The child speaks. So you say, oh, what would you like your topic sentence to be? Oh, I love that idea. That's so great. Let me write that down, or let me type that. How about the second sentence? What about that one? What should it be? Oh, that's a great idea. Write that down or type it down. Now, what are you thinking about the third sentence? What about that one? Love it. Very creative. Awesome. Can you write that one down? So now I've gotten the student over the hump and they're good to go. So the child speaks, you're the scribe, and you type it or you write it to get them going. Now, you can do something very similar without even being in the equation. And that's when you can use tech solutions. So what does that look like? Well, when many kids are doing work online, they're either using Google Docs or they're using Word. In Word and Google Docs, you will see a little black microphone. And that black microphone is for voice to text software. So that means when your child clicks that microphone, he can talk all of his ideas and they are transcribed onto the document for him. I love this idea for students. Now, you can take it one step further with another software called Rev. And Rev is actually really cool. Rev is a paid for service. I'll talk about that in a second. But instead of just having the ideas on a piece of paper or on a document, there's actually somebody that the information gets mailed to, and they make it neat. So they transcribe it using capital letters, correctly spelled words, correct punctuation, spaces between paragraphs. So now it looks a whole lot more organized. And for some kids, at this point, it's a lot easier for them to edit and then proofread it. Now, Rev, as I mentioned, there is a cost for it. It's $1 per minute. But I found for most kids to write an essay, it's about $5. And for many, it's worth it. Now, let's say that you've tried a lot of things and your child is still stuck. How do you handle resistance? Now, it's so easy to be trying to help your child. And when you're in the midst, you're trying to help them, they're really pushing hard on you. They're not understanding it, or they're telling you this is a dumb idea or this won't work. And what do? You push back on them. You tell them why it will work and that they can do it. And then they resist and they push on you more and you push back. If that's happening, you're in a power struggle and you need to get out of the power struggle. So you need to give your child space and choice. So you say, hey, you know what? I get it. I know that this is frustrating. I've noticed this is hard. I totally understand. Listen, I'm going to be over in my office checking my email for work. When you're ready, come get me and I can help you if you'd like. Alternatively, if you've tried that and you're still struggling, contact the teacher. Teachers are experts in their field and they can help. So when you reach out to the teacher, say, I've noticed. I'm going to come back to these words, I've noticed, in a little bit because I think they're kind of magical words. I'll tell you why. But I like I've noticed because it doesn't put the problem on the teacher like, oh, this assignment is way too hard that you gave, or you know what, Jimmy's never going to get through this assignment. What are you thinking by asking kids to write a 3-paragraph essay in 7th grade? That doesn't help at all, does it? But instead, if you just observe the observable, hey, I've noticed Sarah's having a really hard time with this writing assignment, and this seems to be common. Do you have any ideas? Seek outside help if you're still struggling. I give you permission. You don't have to be your child's teacher. Somebody else can take those reins. It could be a high school student down the street, a college student who's home from break. It could be a professional tutor who knows how to teach writing skills specifically to kids with ADHD. So if that's the case in your family and you want to outsource it, I'm happy to help you. That's what my company does. And if you have your phone nearby, grab your phone, open up the camera, hold the camera up to this QR code, and when you do, a link will appear and you can click it and it will take you to one of my program managers' calendars, And from there, you can schedule an appointment to talk about your child to see if we can help. All right, so we've talked about writing, we've talked about working memory, and we've talked about resistant kids. Let's talk math. Why is math so hard for students? Well, the truth is math is cumulative. That means that one skill builds upon another. So when kids have weaknesses here, it makes everything else they do really difficult for them. And when things are hard and they're missing skills, they might be a Swiss cheese student. Now you're probably wondering, what in the world is a Swiss cheese kid? Here's what a Swiss cheese kid is. Just like Swiss cheese, it kind of has holes in the cheese. Well, really, many kids, especially after COVID, they've got holes in their learning. They have some skills, but not other skills. So when they sit down to do their homework, they're not quite sure what to do. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. But when you're frustrated, what do? You slap down a couple of answers, you don't put forth much effort at all, or you just don't even do it. I was a Swiss cheese kid. I feel these kids' pain. If it's okay and you don't mind, I'd love to take you back to the year of 1983. You might remember it, the year of the Love Boat, Three's Company, and Flashdance. And there I am sitting in my 8th grade algebra class, looking up at the board, watching my teacher drone on and on about how to solve for X. And my neck is hurting and my shoulders ache. And I realize I am never going to get this math. Now, at home, my parents knew I was having difficulty. And this was nothing new in our house. I'd struggled for quite a bit of time. So that night, my dad comes into my room. And who better to help me with my math than my dad, an engineer by trade. He loved numbers, never got less than an A in math, and loved preciseness. So we sit down at my little yellow Ethan Allen desk, and we go to solve the first problem. We get to the end, and I say, oh, it's +3. Here's why. He says it's -3. I insist it's positive. He says it's negative. And then, in a moment of utter frustration, my usually mild-mannered father, his face bright red, his lips pursed, stands up, grabs my math book, and as hard as he can, flings it against the wall, and papers go everywhere. I couldn't believe it. I back up, and I look at him like, Dad, what are you doing? And in hearing all this commotion, my mom runs down the hall and says, that's it, you're getting a tutor. Now, at the time, I thought this was a terrible idea. I did not need a tutor. I could do this myself. But the truth was, I couldn't. And thank goodness my mom did, because that started my understanding of why I was having such difficulty in math. Mr. Rogo showed me the way. He taught me that actually I could learn math. But this way I was going about it in this large classroom with the teacher at the front of the room, it wasn't working for me. So the first thing he did, he went back and he filled in those holes. My Swiss cheese was not so holy after all. He was able to fill in my gaps from learning. He taught me how to study, which I'll talk about in a second. And then at the end of each session, he would take 5 minutes and he would preview what was coming next in class, so that when I went back to class the next day, I felt so much more confident and focused because I knew what was going on. I wasn't so lost. Now, here's the thing. Many kids are like me. You know, I can relate. But now it's even worse. And it's worse because there's a lot of fallout from COVID in the form of math anxiety. And we know that the recovery from learning loss because of COVID is even more pronounced in math. In fact, just this year in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, this study found that there's more anxiety, as I mentioned, than ever before. And what's contributing to it is poor study habits. So what happens when kids are anxious about math or they're Swiss cheese and they don't know what to do? They have a quiz or a test They come home, they take out their notes or their study guide, they glance through it, they read through a couple of pages, and they say, I've studied. That is not studying. I know that. Mr. Rogo taught me. He said, in order to study for a test, you need to take a couple of practice problems that you already did, make yourself a little practice test, and work through those problems. And if you're stuck, you refer back to the example that you have. That is how you study. But unfortunately, for many kids, especially our avoidant kids with ADHD, they think they know it or they don't, and there's nothing you can do. This isn't true. There is a way to study for math. So if you see this in your home, you see that you have a Swiss cheese child, or you see that your child doesn't have very good study habits, I would advise not to approach your child in the moment if they're frustrated. Instead, set time aside, maybe later in the evening, and use those words again. I've noticed. You might say, if your child has lots of outstanding work, like maybe they have 5 assignments they haven't done. What we don't want to do is say, oh, Jimmy, I just went onto your portal and I saw you have 5 overdue assignments in math. What is going on? What are you thinking? When are you going to do those? That's not helpful. Instead, you might say, hey, I noticed it's hard to stay on top of your math homework. Or if your child's struggling with a specific skill, you might say, I've noticed equations are really hard. Tell me about that. Why are you saying, tell me about that? Well, you're saying it because you want to open the dialogue with your child. You want to hear from their side what's going on. And during this time, you don't want to pass judgment and you do not want to try to fix the problem. Your job is to listen. Ah, I get it. I see. Nod and empathize. You're right. This is really hard. I totally get it. I can see why you're frustrated. That opens the door to a conversation. So if this might be helpful to your family, if you feel like there's a lot of tension back and forth with your child and you can use a few communication strategies, I put them all together. I have lots into a handout for you, and you can get it by texting the same number, 55444, and the word communication. All right, so as I mentioned with writing, sometimes your child is just stuck, and that's just how it is, even though you've done many of the right things. When that happens and you're working with your child, especially younger kids, sometimes older kids don't want us to work with them, but let's say you have a younger child and they're super stuck. Here's what you can do. You actually have 3 choices as the adult. You can say, this is your homework, not mine. I already went to 4th grade. That is not helpful because it makes kids think that you're just not going to be there for them and you're not willing to help them. Or you could say, well, this is how you do it. Let me show you how. Inevitably, your child will say, that's not how Mrs. Anderson said to do it, because the way kids do math is different than the way we did it back in the day. Or you could say, do you have examples of this in your notes or in your book? And this is the best question to ask because it allows kids to be a little bit more independent, to look back at other examples that might guide them, examples that have already been solved. And that's what we want kids to do, is try to help themselves, to refer back to something that they've already had success with. So when you're working with your child, that's really one of the first steps, is to ask, are there notes that you can look at? Even when we work with kids, we'll always say, can you show me how you did this in class? That way everybody's on the same page. Other things you can do at home would be to use graph paper. So graph paper helps otherwise kind of disorganized kids to have structure for their math problems. Each number goes in a box. They can now draw a straight line. It's much easier. And if your child's stuck on word problems, not as much computation, which is common, encourage them to draw pictures. Say, oh, what does that look like in pictures? Can you draw that out? And having a visual depiction is much easier to help kids solve problems. So at the end of the day, I've shared with you lots of strategies, but we also want our kids to be advocates for themselves, to ask for help when they need it. And for many teachers, that is in the form of an email. Certainly kids can go in after school or in lunch. But if you ask teachers what's the best way for me to correspond with you, most will say email. The problem is if you say to your child, hey, John, I think you should talk to your teacher about that. Why don't you send her an email? Well, if you have a child who's passive, he might say, oh, sure, I'll do it later. And he never will. And if you have a kid that's a little bit more confrontational, he'll say, no, I'm not doing that. That's a terrible idea. However, I have a solution, and it is actually in the form of an email. Let me share with you an email that a student wrote to a teacher, and then tell me what you think. Dear Mrs. Smith, good morning. I'm writing to you about my algebra quiz corrections. When I log on to Schoology, it shows as submitted. However, it's now been more than 2 weeks, and there is no grade associated with this. Please let me know if something is missing or if you need me to resubmit it. Thanks for your time, and I will see you in class this afternoon. Mary. All right, I know what you're thinking. My child would never do this. True. If you say, why don't you write a letter to Mrs. Smith? They're not going to come back with something like this. And to be honest, most kids in this day and age have poor skills when it comes to communication, especially over email. However, let me share a template with you that we use. And it looks like this. It's fill in the blank, and anybody can do it, I promise. Dear teacher's name. Good morning. The blank says, always include a friendly greeting. It tells the student what to do. I am writing to you about, explain the problem and what you've already done to solve it. So it's very clear exactly what the student has to do. In that way, they have a framework, kind of like a graphic organizer, that makes the process of asking for help so much easier. I've put this together in other advocacy tidbits for you in a handout, and you can get this one by texting that same number, 55444, but this time write the word advocacy, ADVOCACY, and it will come to you. All right, so what are the benefits of getting outside help? Well, if your child can meet with the teacher on a regular basis, not just one and done, but over time, that's ideal. One-to-one attention is best for kids with ADHD. The reason this is helpful, whether it be meeting with the teacher, the high school, or the college student down the street, or a professional, is that it builds foundational skills. The other thing it does is it helps kids with much needed consistency. So often when kids are having a hard time, they'll get help here and there. They'll learn a strategy here and there. But honestly, that is not the solution. If you learn a strategy, but you do not practice it day in and day out or week in and week out, it's no good. It's not going to stick. You want to practice it with regularity so that becomes a habit ultimately. So it can help with consistency and really getting outside help. And I give you permission to do this. It can really improve your relationship and reduce family stress. So we talked about math, we talked about writing, we talked about working memory and all the things that are going on with our kids during the school year. Let's move into the summer and talk about things that you might be able to do this summer, kind of like putting vegetables in the quesadilla when your kids were younger and they didn't want to eat them, so that they don't even know that they're learning along the way. So here's the issue with summer. There's this thing called the summer slide. You may have heard about it. It's actually been well studied for many, many years. And what we know is that if kids do absolutely nothing over the summer, it's really bad for them when they go into the fall, because they lose about 3 months of progress in math and in language arts. And we do not want that for our kids. So if you take the summer slide and you couple it with already the learning loss kids have experienced because of COVID, it could be the perfect storm. So we want to figure out, all right, what is it that I can do over the summer to make a difference so that my child goes back in the fall, not only prepared, but feeling good and confident. So here's a couple of easy ideas. Number one, this works great, especially for younger kids. Set up stations. You might know Montessori classrooms. Instead of a teacher teaching from the front of the room, there are stations set up, like tables with things for kids to do. You can kind of do something similar in your house. So let's say you want your kids to read. Don't keep the books in their room. Get a bin, take a bunch of books, put them by the couch. That's their reading station. Maybe you want your child to improve their fine motor skills. Put out some coloring books, some art projects at the dining room table. That's their art station. One of my favorite things to do is actually to put out puzzles or Legos. And I'm a huge fan of puzzles. During the pandemic, I had my nieces and nephews and my kids with me, and I always had a puzzle going on our dining room table. And I personally like puzzles as an educator because they help with critical thinking. They help with this idea of looking ahead to the next steps. These are all executive function skills. But also puzzles really give kids a different feeling in this era of immediate gratification, and especially in the form of video games, where they have to be patient and think ahead. But what else a puzzle does is it brings people to the watering hole. So you might find you're sitting there with your child and now you're talking, which you may not have done before. The other thing you can do is to incorporate math in the things that you already do every day. Let's take the kitchen. You're cooking dinner. Oh, hey, could your child actually do some measuring? That's an idea. So have them do anything that's related to fractions, because when kids are young, third, fourth grade, fractions, decimals, and percent are the proving ground for pre-algebra and algebra. And as I mentioned before, algebra is the proving ground for every other math class kids will ever see through calculus. So these skills are really important. All right, so let them do the measuring. Ask questions like, oh, 3/4 cup of flour, is that closer to 0 or to 1? So they get the sense of what a fraction really is. Shopping, have them make the list. Estimate prices. Go to the store, ask, is that close to your estimate? Oh, the bread is $3.89. Is that closer to $3.50 or $4? At a restaurant, have them leave the tip. Well, if 10% is $2.50, what's 20%? You can also incorporate good old-fashioned practice at home. When my kids were young, I'd always have a workbook going. And that means before they went to camp or went out for the day, and literally this was 10 minutes, sometimes 5, but it was really short. I'd find a workbook that they could do independently, and they both need help with math. So I would find a workbook. For the older one, it might have been multiplication and division or addition and subtraction, where it's based on repetition, where they can do it independently and they're practicing a skill. That for kids with ADHD is a lot better than buying a workbook like the Bridge series that are super popular, and they have been for many years, that create a lot of frustration. So we often see these and think they're a good idea. Oh, a bridge from 7th grade to 8th grade. I'll review 7th grade, preview 8th grade. These are super frustrating for kids. And part of the reason is they haven't seen all of this content yet. So they don't know how to do a lot of it. And that's when friction occurs and lots of frustration and avoidance. So I would say find something easy. Use a timer. Make it short. Trick their brain into thinking it's not so hard after all. You can also use screens. Not all screens are created equal. There are some that are actually pretty good for kids. So if you're practicing math, it might be Archidemics, which is a video game format for younger students, or Starfall to help young kids learn to read. But for older students, middle and high school, and even older elementary, I really love IXL. And I like IXL because it's known for its math, but it also has other subjects too. And it allows kids to work through at their own pace. So you've got Archidemics, Starfall, and IXL.com, as I mentioned. And then if your child needs some work on writing, and it's just kind of a long shot to say, why don't you write a 3-paragraph essay this summer? Never going to happen. Or why don't you do a book report? It's hard to pull that off. You could do something that's easy and pleasurable and fun for both you and your child. And that's in the form of a dialogue journal, really cheap. Go to the dollar store and grab a composition book. And in it, every day, you ask your child a question based on something that they like. Oh, I love how you passed it to Avery at the last minute. How did you know she was open? That was such an amazing goal she scored. Now your child can write back about something that he already likes and share information. The next day, you write back something different. And so you've just got this little conversation going. But I would say, don't correct grammar and spelling. Don't correct anything, which I know sometimes is hard. You have to avoid it because if your child feels judged or criticized, they will not do it. Similarly, they could do a travel journal. So if you're away on a trip, you could say, before we go out today, I want you to write a summary of what you did yesterday. Draw some pictures, make it fun. Reading is also something else you can tackle in the summer in the form of deer time. Drop everything and read. I always did deer time when I was a teacher. I loved it because it was a nice time for kids to cuddle up in with their little mat and read something that they wanted to read. You can do it with your whole family. Maybe a couple nights a week you do deer time. Other things that you can do for reading include you read a page, I read a page. If you think your child won't read independently, get involved. Or for a really reluctant reader, I read 2 pages, you read 1 page. Again, no criticism. So if your child, things that kids with ADHD do frequently when they read is they drop word endings, like they leave off the S, or they leave out articles like a, the, things like that. Leave it alone. Don't go there. And if there's a word that they say is completely different and it totally affects their understanding, you can correct that. But everything else, leave it alone. Because again, we want kids to think this is fun and pleasurable. We don't want them to feel criticized. Listening to audiobooks is also perfectly fine. And then lastly, turn on those TV captions. If you're watching Netflix or YouTube TV, studies show that when people have captions on, their eyes naturally gravitate to the captions, and that can help with their fluency and comprehension of the material. So it's kind of like vegetables in that quesadilla. They don't even know that they're really learning. As kids get older, however, especially in the high school ages, we want them to think beyond what's going on now and start to think about their next steps. So if you have a child who's thinking about college, I would say that early is better to start the dialogue. It doesn't need to be high pressure. It could be, oh, have you begun thinking about college? Have you had this discussion with your friends? Tell me about that. Again, you're just being a listener. You're starting the dialogue. And anytime we can start things a little bit on the earlier side with kids with ADHD, because we know sometimes if things are hard for them, they'll avoid it outright. That's even better. So I've prepared for you a really awesome downloadable checklist for each grade level. So what to do when your child is in 9th grade, when you're thinking about college, all the steps for 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. And you can get this by texting the word college to that same number, 55444, and that will come straight to you. So this would be for parents with kids 8th grade and above that are starting to think ahead. All of these things, they're easier said than done. We can expect glitches along the way, that's for sure. So we want to narrow the focus and think about things that are low-hanging fruit. Like, what could we do that's easy? Maybe we will use the words I've noticed. Maybe we put out a puzzle this summer. Maybe we start the dialogue about college. But what we can control is keeping it positive. We cannot control what our child does, but we can control how we respond. And for that reason, I invite you to the 10-day challenge. So for the next 10 days, you are going to notice something good your child does each day. It might be something small. Oh, I noticed the way you came in and hung your coat up on the hook. Thank you. Oh, I noticed that you started your work before soccer practice. I love that. What a great idea. I noticed that you put the dishes in the sink. Thank you for doing that. That makes a big difference. When kids hear good things, it increases positivity and it makes them want to do it again. All right. So thank you so much. I hope that this was helpful to you and that in the end, you can preserve relationships with your kids. And if that means outsourcing some of the heavy lifting to somebody else, sometimes that is a good idea. It was a pleasure to speak to all of you today. Let me leave you with my contact information before we go to Q&A. Again, my name is Ann Dolin. My email is ann@ectutoring.com. I'll respond to you right away. And I put together a goodie bag for you, and you can get that. It has all the things we talked about at ectutoring.com/newsletter. And again, here's the QR code if you would like to talk about your child. Annie, thank you so much. I'd love to turn it over to you for Q&A.
Wonderful, Anne. Thank you. And thanks to everyone joining us. If you did encounter any technical difficulties with texting, we will get those sorted out and we will make sure everyone gets the different resources. I think there were 4 different codes that could be texted. So look for that in your follow-up email if you had any problems. And I just want to quickly, again, thank Landmark College for sponsoring today's webinar. I will kick it off with a number of questions from parents who are focusing on the next 6 to 8 weeks of the academic year, catching up on outstanding assignments. And this seems to be a problem mostly with middle school and high school students. Would you recommend written communication with the teacher as a first step there? A lot of pushback on the written communication is what I'm gathering from our comments here, and parents wondering whether they really should, force the issue.
Well, first, when there are a lot of outstanding assignments, you have to figure out what absolutely needs to get done. Because I've seen kids, with like 30 assignments that they have to do, and it's just unrealistic. And so some of this is a negotiation with the teacher. All right, there's 6 assignments he has to do in history. Can any of these go by the wayside? Could he just do, what are the most important ones? Sometimes teachers in high school will talk to the parent and they will have open communication. Others say, I'm only going to talk to your child. And if that's the case, I would help your child write the email to the teacher outlining and asking the right questions about what can be negotiated in terms of assignments. So when it comes to that, I found that putting everything on a Google Doc, or at least what we've done with kids that have a lot of work that's overdue, is first we'll figure out, okay, what do they really have to do? What's a must do, not kind of like a nice to have? And that's all we put on this document. And then we'll work through it with the kids in order to, get stuff done. And we'll remove that. And the next thing goes up on the list. And we'll typically, and you can do this with your child, organize the list into a must do, could do, should do. Okay, must do's are all at the top. And that means they count for a lot of the grade and they're really important. Should do's may not count so much, and maybe they're just not that important, or you're already doing kind of well in that class. And then could do's, they might be assignments that teachers say, you need to do this, but they're nice to have. They're like not worth that many points. And they're just not that important for the overall GPA. So I would maybe put those at the bottom of the list and just focus on what's on the top of the list.
Okay, great advice. And maybe some color coding and helping with prioritization to, as we often say, to chunk up the task and make it less overwhelming. Similarly, parents of some older students, those who are looking at the transition to middle school or high school, what do you think are some reasonable expectations for their summer learning, specifically in math and writing? You made some good suggestions about the journal and continued math work. What do you think is sort of reasonable to expect from a rising middle school or high school student?
I would first start with the teacher, and I'd go to the English teacher or go to the math teacher and say, based on what you know about my child, what do you think would be a good thing? What are the skills my child needs to work on over the summer? Do you have any resources for this? And let them guide you. Because sometimes teachers will say, I know we went over this, but to be honest, it's not that important for next year. You want to find out what are the skills that are really important that they need to know for next year. Because if they're missing those skills, it's going to be hard for them to be successful. And if math has been a constant bone of contention and it's just chronically been difficult, I'd probably start there, because if you start out the year not understanding the math, it's incredibly hard to catch up. Math isn't a subject like history or science. You can kind of teach yourself a little bit because it's language based, but you cannot do that in a math-based science. So that would be in high school, chemistry, physics, or a foreign language. Once you get behind, it's incredibly difficult to dig yourself out of those situations. So I would think, what are the subjects that are cumulative, the ones that I just mentioned? And that's where I might focus a little bit over the summer and talk to the teacher about what might be helpful.
Okay, wonderful. And for those who are looking at tutoring services or other academic supports, is it reasonable to expect that that a service such as yours would first assess the child and see where the weaknesses are? A number of parents saying they're not 100% sure exactly why their child is struggling.
I think that's helpful. So we do have an assessment that we provide to see where their gaps are. Like if they are Swiss cheese, I want to know where those holes are. And that's really important, because you don't want a program that's just like a one size fits all. That's not going to really help your child to catch up. So yes, it is reasonable to, if you hire a tutor or, your child takes a class, that there needs to be an assessment in the beginning to figure out where they're having weaknesses, because parents just don't know. I mean, your child's struggling, but you don't know exactly what skills. So that assessment is key.
Okay, perfect. And here's a challenge that I've been hearing from quite a few listeners today, that their child actually puts in the effort to study, does a lot of the, creating their own sample tests, as you suggested, seems to understand the concepts. And then when it comes to test time, they really struggle getting that information from their brain onto paper. Do you have any suggestions for those kids? And any ideas of accommodations that could possibly help them?
It could be test anxiety, and we see this all the time. Sometimes it's not test anxiety, and the child honestly just hasn't prepared very well, and that's why they're anxious. But a lot of times kids are very prepared, and they get into the situation, and their heart is racing, their palms are sweaty, they don't feel great, they're a little bit nauseous. Those are all signs that there are physiological symptoms of feeling super anxious about the test. So one of the best ways to beat test anxiety, proven by research, is kind of what you mentioned just a second ago, Annie, to create practice tests and to go through them regularly before the test, to feel like you're simulating the test environment. So there's research that shows if you get a study guide from your teacher, you need to make 3 copies of it, not just do it one time and say you studied, but you make 3 copies of it. You do it the first time to the point where, you may not know some of the answers, and you look back and you fill it in. So once you got it filled in, then the next day you do the next one. And now you're still going to have things you don't know. That's okay. You can refer to the first one. And then you do it a 3rd time. And by this time, not only have you practiced the skills, but you've also practiced the pacing if it's a time test. And you've put yourself in that situation where you're in a simulated environment. Certainly a common accommodation is extra time, like time and a half, or it could be a separate room, like a safe, quiet space to do the work. And that's an acceptable accommodation as well.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, a number of parents saying that their child, loses points for things like transcribing a number incorrectly or adding instead of subtracting. So frustrating when they know the concepts, and perhaps extra time could allow them to go back and double check that work at the very least. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one last short one. You had suggested that when studying, having your notes handy for exactly that, creating those sample tests is very useful, except a number of students really struggle with the actual note-taking process. Have you seen students having luck working with a note-taking buddy? we've heard of this accommodation before, and I wonder if it might be appropriate for some parents out there to suggest.
I think a note-taking buddy is fine, but sometimes what happens is that we over-accommodate kids and we think, oh, we'll just have my child get a copy of the notes from the teacher, or I'll have a note-taking buddy take the notes and my child can read them. But that's really not how the brain works. Your brain is going to retain the information better if you take some of the notes. So you don't have to take them all. It might be going too fast, but you take your version of the notes and then you cross compare with your buddy version of the notes. So if you have a little bit, he has some more, now you have a complete set of notes. Other things, I would recommend maybe the traditional format of taking notes isn't helpful. There's something called Cornell notes, which we've used with kids for many years. And I found this to be a helpful way of taking notes for kids with ADHD. And you can further augment it by, when you're taking a note, to draw a picture of it. And for a lot of kids, like that little picture or that depiction that they draw at that moment helps trigger their memory. So when they are reviewing their notes and they're practicing their notes, looking at that picture helps them recall what they learned in class.
Wonderful. Very, very helpful advice here. And I'm sorry to say we have run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today. Anne, this was a fantastic presentation, gave us a lot of resources to move forward through the end of the school year and into the summer. And I do want to just let our listeners know that ADDitude does offer free webinars every week, and we hope you'll join us for next week's on emotional dysregulation in teens with ADHD with Dr. Ellen Lippman. To make sure you don't miss any of our other webinars, you can visit ADDitudemag.com/newsletters, and you can choose the ADDitude webinar announcements right there. So, Anne, thank you so much. Listeners, thank you so much. We hope you have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye, everybody.